In September 2014, a 3-year-old boy vanished in less than 5 minutes, while adults sat just meters away. That morning, William Tyrrell was playing hide-and-seek in a quiet Australian street, dressed as Spider-Man, his small footsteps darting between sunlight and shadow. Years later, police would return to the very place he was last seen, not with hope, but with shovels. What that return would reveal would fracture the story Australia thought it knew. September in New South Wales carried a soft kind of warmth, the sort that crept in gently during the morning and lingered without burning. The air in Kendall smelled faintly of eucalyptus and dry earth, stirred by a light breeze drifting in from the surrounding bush. Benaroon Drive was quiet, almost hushed, a dead-end street where cars moved slowly and neighbors waved because they recognized one another. It was the kind of place people described as safe without thinking twice. The house sat modestly along the road, its backyard stretching toward the edge of the Kendall State Forest. From the front, you could hear birds calling from the trees across the road, their cries sharp and rhythmic, cutting through the stillness. At certain hours, the forest seemed close enough to touch, a wall of green that promised adventure to a child and reassurance to an adult who believed nothing dangerous could come from something so familiar. Inside this ordinary setting was an ordinary family moment, unremarkable in every way that matters, until it wasn't. William was 3 years old, small for his age, with a restlessness that never quite switched off. He moved the way young children do, in bursts, running, stopping, spinning, dropping suddenly to the ground and springing back up again as if gravity were optional. His favorite thing to wear wasn't chosen for comfort or practicality. It was chosen for power. A red and blue Spider-Man suit, thin fabric stretched over a child's frame, the mask pulled back so he could breathe easily, the spider emblem pressed proudly against his chest. In that suit, William wasn't just a toddler. He was invincible. He had arrived in Kendall the afternoon before, after a 4-hour drive north from Sydney. The trip itself had been uneventful. Long stretches of road, the low hum of tires on asphalt, the drowsy calm that settles into a car once children grow tired of asking how much longer. By the time they reached Benaroon Drive, the light was already softening, shadows stretching across the yard. William ran ahead as soon as the door opened, his shoes crunching against gravel, his voice high and excited as he explored a place he had visited before. That night passed quietly. No arguments, no strange phone calls, no sense of unease. The house slept as houses always do, wrapped in darkness, unaware of the weight it would soon carry. Morning came early. Sunlight filtered through the windows, pale and clean, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Outside, the temperature was mild, cool enough that breath still felt fresh in the lungs. It was the kind of morning that invited children outdoors before breakfast dishes were even dry. William was dressed in his Spider-Man suit again before anyone suggested it. The fabric smelled faintly of detergent and the outdoors, a mix of yesterday's play and hurried washing. He tugged at the sleeves, impatient, already halfway out the door before anyone finished speaking. His sister followed close behind, older by 2 years, accustomed to keeping pace with his energy. The yard became their world. They ran along the grass, shoes damp with dew, laughter bouncing off the walls of the house. They darted between the front and back, inventing rules that changed every few seconds. Hide and seek wasn't just a game. It was a performance. William crouched behind trees that didn't quite hide him, pressed himself against walls with exaggerated seriousness, then burst into motion with a triumphant shout when he was found. 8. Adults watched from nearby, close enough to intervene, far enough to let the children feel free. Chairs scraped lightly against concrete as they were repositioned for a better view. A mug was set down, steam rising briefly before vanishing into the air. There was no tension in their posture, no urgency in their movements. This was routine. This was safe. From the yard, the forest loomed quietly. No rustling branches, no sudden movement, just a dark green mass standing still, patient, indifferent. William ran past the side of the house, his feet slapping softly against the ground. He made a sound, a playful roar, exaggerated and joyful, the noise of a child pretending to be something fierce. It echoed faintly, then dissolved into the open air. That was the last sound anyone would ever hear from him. Minutes passed without notice. 5 of them, maybe less. Time, at that scale, doesn't announce itself. It slips by unnoticed when nothing feels wrong. Someone stepped inside to make tea, the kettle clicking on, the smell of hot metal beginning to rise. From the doorway, the yard still looked empty but unremarkable. Children moved fast. They doubled back. They hid. Silence settled in slowly, almost politely. When it was finally felt, it didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as confusion. A name called once, then again, louder. Footsteps across the grass, eyes scanning corners that had held a child seconds earlier. The house was checked, room by room, the air inside cooler, dimmer than outside. No answer, no movement. The quiet deepened. What had moments earlier been a peaceful morning began to shift, the atmosphere tightening like a drawn breath. Chairs were abandoned. Doors opened and closed. The yard was searched again, more deliberately this time. Hands parting bushes, eyes tracking the fence line. The forest stood unchanged, offering nothing. In a place where nothing bad ever happened, something had already gone terribly wrong. And before anyone could understand how, the game was over, the yard was empty, and a 3-year-old boy, who believed he was a superhero, was nowhere to be seen. West Des Moines remained half asleep as the morning edged forward. The sky lightened slowly, shifting from deep blue to a thin gray, the kind that made everything look unfinished. Porch lights still glowed on some houses, while others had already gone dark. The street smelled faintly of dew and paper ink, the quiet broken only by distant engines starting up for church or early errands. Johnny pulled his wagon steadily, the metal wheels rattling softly against the pavement. Gretchen trotted beside him, her leash slack in his hand. She paused once to sniff at the edge of a lawn, then hurried to catch up. Johnny adjusted his grip on the handle and kept moving, his breath visible for a moment before disappearing into the cool air. This part of the route always came first. A short walk north, then the deliveries would begin. Near the paper drop, the blue two-toned car sat angled toward the curb. The man standing beside it watched Johnny approach. He was stocky, his jacket zipped up against the cold, his hands tucked into the pockets. When Johnny drew level with him, the man spoke, his voice low and casual, as if the question were nothing more than a passing thought. "Hey, kid," he said. "Can you tell me how to get to 8th Street? Johnny stopped. He shifted his weight, glancing at the car, then back at the man. He knew the streets well enough. He lifted one hand and started explaining, pointing briefly before hesitating. Another paperboy, John Rossi, stood nearby, tearing open his own bundle of newspapers. He looked up as he heard Johnny talking to the man. Something about the scene caught his attention. The way the man stood too close. The way he watched Johnny's face instead of the street. Johnny turned slightly toward Rossi. "He's asking for directions," Johnny said. "Can you help me?" Rossi stepped closer, listening as the man repeated the question. Rossi glanced at the car again. Blue, two-toned. He noticed the license plate without trying to memorize it. The man nodded, thanked them, and stepped back. Johnny tightened his grip on the wagon handle and started walking north. The blue car stayed where it was. As Johnny moved farther from the paper drop, the street stretched out ahead of him, quiet and empty. The houses along this block looked identical in the dim light, their windows dark, their driveways vacant. Gretchen's nails clicked against the sidewalk, the sound rhythmic and familiar. A short distance behind him, footsteps echoed softly. Another paperboy glanced over his shoulder and saw a second man walking behind Johnny. The man kept his distance, far enough back to look incidental, close enough to remain clearly on the same path. The boy watched for a few seconds, then turned away, unsure what he was seeing. Johnny didn't look back. He reached the point where his route officially began, the place where he would normally stop, pull a newspaper from the stack, and start making deliveries. Instead, the wagon slowed. The handle dipped slightly. Something interrupted the flow of movement that had carried him there. Nearby, a neighbor inside her house heard a sharp sound, a car door slamming shut. She looked up from her kitchen window just in time to see a silver Ford Fairmont speeding north. The car moved fast, too fast for the quiet street, its engine noise rising sharply before fading into the distance. She frowned, trying to place why it caught her attention, then turned back to what she was doing. The sidewalk where Johnny had been moments earlier stood empty. The wagon sat a short distance away, angled toward the curb. The newspapers inside were still neatly stacked, untouched. Gretchen stood nearby, confused, tugging lightly at the leash that no longer led anywhere. Time continued to move. Across the neighborhood, people began waking up. Coffee pots gurgled to life. Radios clicked on. Doors opened and closed. The sun crept higher, washing the street in pale light. At the Gosh house, the phone rang. Noreen answered, her voice still thick with sleep. The caller complained about a missing newspaper. Noreen apologized automatically, promising to look into it. When the phone rang again, then again, the pattern began to feel wrong. Johnny was punctual. Johnny didn't miss houses. She checked the clock. It was past 6. John Gosh pulled on his shoes and stepped outside. The air felt colder than it should have, sharp against his face. He walked quickly at first, then faster, following the route he had walked so many times before. His eyes scanned the sidewalk, the curbs, the driveways. He spotted the wagon almost immediately. It stood alone 2 blocks from their home, its red metal frame stark against the gray concrete. Newspapers filled it to the top. None had been delivered. The handle rested at an odd angle, as if it had slipped from a hand mid-motion. John stopped. For a moment, he didn't move at all. He stared at the wagon, his chest tightening as he took in what wasn't there. No Johnny, no movement, just the quiet hum of the neighborhood beginning its day. He turned and ran back toward the house. Inside, Noreen looked up as he burst through the door. One look at his face told her something was wrong. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to speak. "The wagon," he said, his voice tight. "It's still full." Noreen's hand went to her mouth. She stood frozen for a second, then reached for the phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed, her mind racing ahead faster than her body could follow. Outside, Gretchen wandered back toward the house on her own, the leash dragging along the sidewalk behind her. By the time the police were called, the morning had fully arrived. The sun sat higher now, bright enough to cast clear shadows along the street. Neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the tension in the air. Word spread quickly, carried from porch to porch in hushed voices. A boy was missing. Johnny Gosh had vanished somewhere between the paper drop and the start of his route. No one had heard a scream. No one had seen a struggle. The street itself offered no answers, only the stillness of a place where something had ended without announcement. As officers began arriving, notebooks in hand, the wagon remained where it was found. The newspapers lay untouched, the ink smudging faintly onto Johnny's fingers, where he had last handled them. By late morning, Benaroon Drive no longer resembled a quiet residential street. Police vehicles lined the curb, radios murmured constantly, and uniformed figures moved in deliberate patterns that turned the yard, the house, and the surrounding road into defined zones of attention. The warmth of the earlier hours had given way to a sharper heat, one that pressed down steadily, drawing sweat to foreheads and making the air feel heavier with each passing minute. The first priority was containment. Officers established a perimeter around the property, tape stretching across access points, while others began the slow, careful work of documenting everything exactly as it appeared at that moment. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, capturing the position of gates, the condition of the ground, the spacing between structures. Nothing was moved unless it had to be. Nothing was assumed. Inside the house, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less tense. The air smelled faintly of warm appliances and cleaning products, underscored now by the unfamiliar presence of strangers moving through private rooms. Officers opened doors, checked under beds, behind furniture, inside cupboards large enough to conceal a child, even when experience suggested the effort would be futile. The logic was simple and relentless. If a space existed, it had to be checked. Questions were asked repeatedly, not because the answers were expected to change, but because precision mattered. Timelines were revisited in increments of minutes. Who had been sitting where? Who had stood up? Who had gone inside? How long the kettle had been on? Whether anyone had heard a car slow down, stop, or idle nearby. No, came the answer again and again. Nothing unusual. Outside, search teams expanded methodically. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through the bushland across the road, pushing aside branches, scanning the ground for disturbed earth, broken twigs, anything that suggested recent passage. The forest smelled damp and green, thick with decomposing leaves and sap, the ground uneven underfoot. It was easy terrain for an adult to navigate, less so for a 3-year-old. As the hours passed, the search widened, spilling beyond Kendall into surrounding areas. Roads were checked, vehicles were noted. Anyone who had driven through the area that morning was asked to account for their movements. The questions were calm, professional, repetitive, designed to elicit detail rather than reaction. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating the air into submission, flattening treetops and scattering loose debris. From above, the landscape was surveyed in broad strokes: open spaces, water sources, pathways a child might wander toward instinctively. From below, the noise was overwhelming, forcing searchers to rely on hand signals and shouted instructions. Despite the scale of the response, the central problem remained unchanged. There was no clear direction. The dog handler was asked to try again. The dog was led back to the side of the house, the handler crouching low, pointing deliberately, giving space and time. The animal worked the ground carefully, nose sweeping back and forth, tail stiff with focus, then once again circled the same confined area before stopping short, uncertain. "The scent doesn't go past this point," the handler said, straightening slowly, his voice controlled but puzzled. "It just stays." Veerily, that observation was recorded, not interpreted. At this stage, every fact existed in isolation, waiting to be weighed against others. As afternoon approached, fatigue began to creep into the search, not as resignation, but as physical strain. Volunteers rotated in and out. Water bottles were passed around. Shoes and trousers were streaked with dirt and grass stains. Still, no one slowed the pace, because the assumption guiding every decision was the same. Time mattered. In the command area, officers reviewed information as it came in, building a picture piece by piece. Maps were spread across tables, marked with pen and highlighter. Areas searched, crossed off. Zones still to be covered identified. The lack of evidence was itself becoming a point of concern. "If he walked off," one officer said quietly, tracing a line with his finger along the map, "we should have something by now." Another nodded, not disagreeing, but not offering an alternative either. The conversation moved on without conclusion. As evening approached, the light began to change, shadows lengthening across the yard, the temperature dropping just enough to be noticeable. Portable lights were brought in, harsh and white, flooding the area with artificial brightness that erased darkness but also flattened everything it touched. Under those lights, the yard looked smaller, more contained, stripped of its earlier innocence. Inside the house, statements continued. Each person present that morning was spoken to again, their recollections cross-checked against one another. Inconsistencies noted, not as accusations, but as areas requiring clarification. Stress, distorted memory. Investigators knew that. Their task was to separate distortion from contradiction. "I went inside to make tea," she said, repeating the detail as she had before, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I was only gone a few minutes." "How many?" an officer asked gently. "I don't know. 5? Maybe less. And when you came back, he was gone." "Yes." The officer nodded, writing carefully. No judgment in his expression, only focus. Outside, the forest search continued into the fading light. Torches cutting narrow beams through undergrowth, voices calling out less frequently now, not because hope had diminished, but because energy had to be conserved. Each unanswered call echoed longer in the quiet. By nightfall, the reality of the situation began to settle in, not as panic, but as weight. The initial surge of action had given way to something heavier, more methodical, more unsettling. Children did not simply disappear from monitored spaces without leaving something behind, even when taken, even when lost. Search coordinators made the decision to continue through the night. Teams were reorganized. Areas were reassigned. Additional resources were requested. The assumption remained unchanged. The child could still be alive, and every hour counted. Yet, among the investigators, another understanding was forming, shaped not by speculation, but by experience. The absence of evidence, the lack of direction, the confined scent, the empty street. was beginning to suggest that this case would not resolve quickly or cleanly. Near the house, officers stood quietly, looking over the property again, noting how close everything was, how visible the space had been, how little room there seemed for something extraordinary to occur unnoticed. The simplicity of the setting clashed violently with the complexity of the problem it now presented. As the night deepened and the lights burned on, the yard at Benaroon Drive remained at the center of it all, unchanged and unforgiving, offering no answers, only questions that refused to be quiet. And with each hour that passed, the urgency shifted subtly, from frantic hope toward disciplined resolve, as the investigation moved beyond the search for a missing child and into the far more difficult work of understanding how a disappearance like this could happen at all. The days following William's disappearance blurred into one another, marked less by progress than by repetition, as search teams returned again and again to the same terrain, walking the same lines through bushland, knocking on the same doors, retracing the same short stretch of road where nothing appeared to change, except the growing sense that time was slipping away. By the end of the first week, the immediate search had reached its natural limits. Every accessible part of the Kendall State Forest near Benaroon Drive had been combed on foot. Helicopters had flown repeated patterns overhead. Waterways had been checked, and neighboring properties searched more than once. The effort had been immense, coordinated, and relentless, yet it produced no trace of a child who, by all logic, should have left something behind. The investigation shifted accordingly. Strike Force Roseanne was formally established, drawing in detectives and analysts with experience in unexplained child disappearances, people accustomed to working cases where the absence of evidence was not an anomaly but the central problem. Their task was no longer to search blindly, but to reconstruct a vanished moment, using fragments of information that, on their own, meant very little. Timelines were rebuilt again, this time with forensic precision. Every reported movement on Benaroon Drive that morning was logged. Every vehicle seen entering or leaving the street was cataloged. Witness statements were revisited, not because they were suspected to be false, but because memory under stress rarely stayed fixed. 2 vehicles began to draw particular attention. Witnesses recalled seeing a white station wagon and an older gray sedan parked on the street near the Tyrrell home on the morning William disappeared, positioned between driveways on a road where unfamiliar cars stood out. Their drivers were not recognized by locals, and the vehicles were not seen again after that morning. At the time, the information was held back from public release, a deliberate decision made to preserve investigative leverage and avoid contaminating future statements. As weeks turned into months, the scope of the inquiry widened dramatically. Detectives began examining the possibility of an opportunistic abduction, the idea that someone passing through Kendall might have noticed a brief window of vulnerability and acted on impulse. The surrounding area was canvassed for individuals with histories of sexual offending, and investigators conducted interviews with dozens of people whose pasts placed them, however loosely, within the margins of suspicion. The process was methodical, slow, and emotionally draining, both for those conducting it and for the community living under its weight. Kendall, once described as quiet and insular, began to feel exposed. Parents walked their children to school who had previously let them roam freely. Cars that did not belong drew second looks. Ordinary movements took on new meaning. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, altering routines one small decision at a time. As information trickled in from the public, the volume became staggering. Tips arrived from across Australia, then from overseas, each one logged, assessed, prioritized, and often dismissed. More than 1,000 reported sightings were investigated in the years following William's disappearance, ranging from grainy photographs taken in public places to confident eyewitness accounts that dissolved under scrutiny. In Queensland, a photo surfaced of a man and a young boy who bore a resemblance to William. Officers followed the lead immediately, only to confirm within a day that the child was not him. On another occasion, airline staff reported seeing a boy they believed matched William's description on an international flight. The aircraft was met on arrival. The child was identified. The lead ended. Each report carried a brief surge of hope, followed by the same inevitable outcome: nothing. The investigation absorbed these false starts without slowing, driven by the understanding that even improbable leads had to be exhausted. To ignore one, no matter how unlikely, was to accept the risk of missing the one detail that mattered. In September 2016, 2 years after William vanished, the New South Wales government announced a $1 million reward for information leading to his recovery. The size of the reward was unprecedented for a missing person case in the state, and its conditions were notable. It did not require an arrest, a charge, or a conviction. Finding William, in any capacity, was enough. The announcement reignited public attention, but it did not change the underlying reality. Information continued to flow in. Progress did not. Behind the scenes, the case grew heavier with documentation. Thousands of files were created. Hundreds of individuals were formally recorded as persons of interest, not because evidence pointed to them directly, but because the absence of evidence forced investigators to cast wide nets and then narrow them again with patience and discipline. For the detectives assigned to Strike Force Roseanne, the work became an exercise in endurance. Leads were pursued, collapsed, and archived. New theories emerged, were tested, and set aside. Every decision was constrained by the same immutable fact. There was no physical proof of what had happened to William Tyrrell. In some quarters, frustration began to surface. Media scrutiny intensified, questioning investigative decisions, the handling of suspects, the balance between aggressive pursuit and procedural fairness. At least one individual who had come under intense focus would later challenge the methods used against him, arguing that the pressure applied had crossed ethical and legal lines. Those disputes unfolded slowly, in courtrooms far removed from Benaroon Drive, but they cast long shadows over the investigation, reinforcing how high the stakes had become. Meanwhile, the forest remained. Searches were periodically renewed, sometimes in response to new information, sometimes as a means of confirming what had already been searched before. In 2018, police announced a large-scale forensic search of bushland around Kendall, bringing in specialized units trained to detect subtle signs of human remains. The effort lasted weeks. It yielded nothing conclusive. Years passed. For those closest to the case, time did not bring closure, only distance from the moment everything had stopped. The yard on Benaroon Drive returned to stillness. The tape came down. The lights were removed. From the outside, the house looked ordinary again, but the ordinariness felt deceptive now, fragile, as if one wrong glance might crack it open. Despite the lack of answers, the case did not go cold in the traditional sense. It remained active, reviewed regularly, its files revisited with fresh eyes as technology advanced and investigative frameworks evolved. Detectives continued to state publicly that they treated the investigation as if William could still be alive, not as a statement of optimism, but as a professional obligation. Yet beneath that posture, the emotional tone had shifted. Hope, once urgent and loud, had become quieter, more cautious. Determination replaced it, not the kind fueled by expectation, but the kind sustained by refusal. The refusal to accept that a child could vanish so completely without explanation. By the end of the decade, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened on that quiet street in Kendall was not going to be revealed by chance, or by time alone. If the case was going to move forward, it would require something different, something buried deeper than anyone had yet reached. And that understanding, slowly and deliberately, began to redirect the investigation, not outward into forests and highways, but inward, back toward the place where it had all begun. In November 2021, the rhythm of the investigation changed, not with urgency or spectacle, but with a deliberate recalibration that signaled a quiet but profound shift in thinking. Police announced that they would return to Kendall, not to search expanses of bushland in the hope of a wandering child, but to conduct targeted forensic examinations across 3 specific areas surrounding the town, operating under an assumption that had not previously guided public-facing efforts. They were now looking for human remains. The announcement landed heavily, though its language remained restrained, procedural, almost clinical, as if careful phrasing might soften the gravity of what it implied. For years, investigators had maintained a posture of possibility, stating that the case was treated as though William could still be alive until evidence proved otherwise. Now, without offering detail, They acknowledged that new information had altered the frame entirely. Search teams arrived with a different posture than before. There were no wide sweeps, no shoulder-to-shoulder lines cutting through forest undergrowth. Instead, specialists moved slowly, deliberately, guided by forensic strategy rather than urgency. Their attention narrowed to defined plots of land, where soil composition, vegetation patterns, and disturbance markers were examined with exacting care. The work was quiet, methodical, and stripped of the frantic energy that had characterized earlier years. At the same time, investigative focus shifted inward. For the first time, public reporting indicated that the foster mother and the foster grandmother, who had since died, were being treated as persons of interest in William's disappearance. The designation did not carry charges. It did not imply guilt. It reflected a reassessment of earlier assumptions, driven not by suspicion alone, but by inconsistencies that had become more difficult to reconcile with alternative explanations. Investigators began revisiting the earliest moments of the case with renewed scrutiny, examining them not as the chaotic prelude to a suspected abduction, but as a contained sequence of events within a defined environment. The yard, the house, the brief span of minutes in which William was last seen. One possibility, previously considered and set aside, returned to the forefront: an accidental fall. Attention turned to the structure of the house itself, particularly to areas where a small child, moving quickly and unsupervised for moments at a time, might have been vulnerable. A balcony came under review, its height, railing configuration, and proximity to play areas assessed carefully. The scenario did not require elaborate conjecture, only a recognition of how quickly ordinary movement could become catastrophic and how panic might follow in its wake. Investigators did not present the theory as fact. They treated it as a working hypothesis, one that accounted for certain stubborn realities the case had long resisted. The confined scent detected by search dogs, the absence of witnesses, the lack of evidence suggesting William had left the property under his own power or with the assistance of a stranger. What followed was not a public confrontation, but a legal process that unfolded incrementally, often away from cameras and headlines. In April 2022, William's foster mother was charged with providing false or misleading information during a hearing before the New South Wales Crime Commission. The charge focused narrowly on the accuracy of her statements, not on responsibility for William's disappearance itself. When the matter went to trial, the court found her not guilty, a decision that resolved that specific allegation, but did not close the broader investigative questions surrounding the case. The outcome reinforced a tension that had defined the investigation for years. Legal thresholds and investigative belief did not always align. Behind the scenes, detectives continued their work, assembling timelines, re-examining physical layouts, and assessing witness statements against emerging interpretations of events. The passage of time complicated every step. Memories faded. Landscapes changed. Key figures were no longer alive to be questioned. Each of these factors constrained what could be proven, even as investigators felt increasingly confident in their understanding of what had likely occurred. In June 2023, that confidence reached a critical point. Police announced that they had recommended charges against the foster mother for perverting the course of justice and interfering with a corpse, alleging that she had concealed William's accidental death and disposed of his body. The recommendation did not mark the end of the case. It marked a transition from investigation to adjudication, from inference to the burden of proof required by the courts. The allegations, serious and specific, were framed carefully, reflecting the complexity of the evidence on which they were based. Investigators asserted that William had died shortly after his disappearance, and that actions taken in the aftermath had obscured that fact, preventing recovery of his remains and prolonging uncertainty for nearly a decade. The announcement triggered a wave of reaction, measured in some quarters, deeply emotional in others. For many, it represented a devastating reversal of long-held belief, replacing the image of an abducted child with the far more unsettling possibility that the truth had unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, in the place William had last been seen alive. Yet even at this stage, critical elements remained unresolved. William's body had not been found. No confession had been entered. The legal process had not run its course. The case, though dramatically narrowed, was still bound by uncertainty. its resolution dependent not only on investigative conviction, but on what could ultimately be established in court. For detectives who had carried the case for years, the moment was neither triumphant nor cathartic. It was sobering. The kind of development that brought clarity without relief, answers without closure. The realization that the search for William had not failed because of lack of effort, but because the truth, once obscured, had been deliberately shielded from discovery. As legal proceedings loomed, the focus shifted again, this time toward accountability, process, and the long-delayed possibility of formal resolution. The investigation that had once stretched outward across forests, highways, and continents now centered on a small number of actions, decisions, and moments that had occurred in a single morning within the confines of one property. The revelation did not simplify the story. It deepened it, layering grief upon grief, forcing a reckoning not only with what had happened to William Tyrrell, but with how easily certainty could be misplaced, and how devastating the consequences could be when the ordinary was mistaken for the safe. And still, even as the case moved forward under this new framework, one absence remained unchanged, defining every development that followed. William had not been brought home. The first serious crack in the silence did not come from a police briefing or a recovered piece of evidence, but from a man whose life had already been written off by most of the institutions meant to determine truth. In 1989, Paul A. Bonacci, then 21 years old, sat across from his attorney, John DeCamp, in a room that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, and began to describe a childhood that had been stripped away from him long before anyone thought to protect it. His voice moved unevenly, sometimes slowing as if he were navigating something physically painful, sometimes accelerating when memory overtook caution, and he spoke not in theories but in recollections that carried the texture of experience rather than invention. He said Johnny Gosch had been there. Bonacci described being abducted himself as a teenager and drawn into a network that trafficked children methodically, moving them through locations designed to erase identity and attachment, teaching them obedience as a survival mechanism rather than a choice. He said Johnny had been taken deliberately, targeted, and kept alive long enough to understand that disappearance was not an event but a condition. When DeCamp listened, he did not interrupt, noting the way Bonacci avoided dramatic emphasis and instead lingered on small, uncomfortable details that were difficult to fabricate convincingly. When Noreen Gosch later met Bonacci, she did not begin with questions. She watched him. She watched how his eyes moved when he spoke about Johnny, how his hands tightened when he described fear, how he hesitated before certain memories as though deciding whether saying them aloud would cost him something. When he described Johnny's birthmark, the one on his chest, her breath caught involuntarily. And when he added details about a scar on Johnny's tongue and a burn mark on his lower leg, details she had never released publicly, she felt the room tilt around her. "He told me things only my son could have known," she said later, her voice steady but her posture rigid, as though she were holding herself together by intention alone. "Things I never shared." Bonacci said Johnny survived. He said Johnny learned how to obey when obedience kept him alive, how to disappear when disappearance was demanded, and how to speak carefully because speaking freely could cost him everything. He did not describe rescue. He did not describe freedom. He described endurance. Law enforcement dismissed his account almost immediately. The FBI and local authorities declined to interview Bonacci formally, citing inconsistencies in his personal history, statements from siblings who said he was home on the morning Johnny disappeared, and the lack of corroborating physical evidence. To them, his testimony introduced instability into an investigation already burdened by speculation, and they chose not to pursue it further. The case split in two directions that never rejoined. To Noreen, Bonacci was not a perfect witness, but a damaged one, speaking from inside a system designed to leave no clean survivors. To investigators, he was an unreliable narrator whose story could not withstand legal scrutiny, let alone prosecution. Both positions hardened over time, becoming immovable. Years passed before Bonacci spoke again publicly. In 2023, he claimed that Johnny had visited him as well, that he knew about the 1997 visit to Noreen's apartment because Johnny had spoken about it afterward. He offered no physical proof, no photographs, no recordings, only his testimony layered atop decades of unresolved claims. Belief became unavoidable. While authorities maintained that there was no verified evidence Johnny Gosch was alive after 1982, Noreen's understanding of her son's fate continued to sharpen rather than fade. In updated editions of her book, she named men she believed were responsible for orchestrating Johnny's abduction, identifying John David Norman and Philip Pasca as figures connected to organized child exploitation networks, whose operations aligned with the patterns she had documented for years. She did not claim courtroom certainty. She claimed recognition. Then, in 2006, the case ruptured into public attention once more in a way no one could have predicted. The photographs appeared without warning, left at Noreen's doorstep like a message that refused to identify its sender. She examined them alone first, the air in her home suddenly feeling thin and cold as she held the images in her hands, her fingers brushing the edges as if afraid they might dissolve if touched too firmly. One photograph showed 3 boys bound and gagged, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff with fear or performance. Another, black and white, appeared to show a boy Noreen believed was Johnny at around 12 years old, his mouth covered, his hands and feet restrained, and what looked like a brand visible on his shoulder. A third image showed a man who appeared lifeless, something wrapped around his neck. Noreen released the images publicly. The reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Investigators traced some of the photographs to a website associated with child pornography, and an anonymous letter soon arrived at the Des Moines Police Department claiming the images had nothing to do with Johnny Gosch at all. The letter described an earlier investigation in Florida from the late 1970s involving boys who had staged an escape contest, insisting the photographs were misinterpreted and cruelly repurposed. A former Hillsborough County detective, Nelson Zalva, confirmed he had investigated similar images decades earlier, stating that he had interviewed the boys involved and found no evidence of coercion or criminal behavior. He could not, however, produce the original photographs or documentation to conclusively prove they were the same images Noreen had received. According to later reporting, law enforcement identified 3 of the boys in the images. The 4th boy, the one Noreen believed was Johnny, remained unidentified. The uncertainty did not dissolve. It thickened. For critics, the photographs illustrated how grief could distort perception, how coincidence could masquerade as confirmation. For supporters, they represented yet another instance where truth brushed against exposure only to retreat again behind procedural doubt. Noreen did not retreat. She continued to insist, quietly and consistently, that she recognized her son, not from theory or hope, but from memory sharpened by decades of attention. By this point, the case no longer belonged solely to investigators or even to the Gosch family. It lived in documentaries, in courtrooms, in public arguments about credibility and denial. When Who Took Johnny was released in 2014, it did not resolve anything. Instead, it presented the case as it had always existed, fractured, unresolved, and suspended between official disbelief and maternal certainty. Interviews with Johnny's parents laid competing truths side by side without forcing reconciliation, leaving the audience in the same position the case had occupied for more than 3 decades. No arrests followed, no confrontations, no legal reckoning. The revelations of the case did not arrive with handcuffs or verdicts, but with the uncomfortable realization that some crimes leave behind only testimony and absence, and that truth, when stripped of proof, becomes a question of who is willing to listen. The tension did not break. It lingered. If Johnny Gosch survived, he had learned how to remain invisible. And if he did not, the echoes of his disappearance refused to fade quietly into history. What do you think happened to William Tyrrell? Do you believe this was a tragic accident, followed by fear and concealment? Or do you believe there is still something missing, something yet to be uncovered? Your thoughts matter, because in cases like this, the conversation itself is part of how we remember the child at the center of it all. Take a moment and tell us what you think.